I grew up in northeast Iowa where my older sister and I spent most of our childhood playing in the meadows and woods around our property. She was 2 years older than me, and we had a neighbor friend who was between us in age. Most of our days were filled with fishing and catching frogs and playing make-believe and conquering the world. There was a pond down the hill from our house where a lot of this took place. North of it was 20 acres of timber that provided an excellent spot to hunt for mushrooms in the spring or to cool down in the shade during the hot summer months. And to us, it was paradise. West of that timber was a green, inviting pasture full of long grass that made the perfect bed to lie in when we wanted to watch the clouds. And the land was owned by Mr. Lindahl, who had fenced it off, but he was a neighbor of ours who lived down the road, and he had given us permission to play wherever we wanted. The meadow included its own pond that was roughly an acre in size, and we spent as much time fishing and playing around it as we did our own pond. And that was where we were headed the day that we had our first encounter. My sister, who was 10 at the time, decided it would be a great place to play that day. Our neighbor friend and I weren't going to argue, so off we set. And pretending to be on a safari, we hacked our way through the timber that had become a fearsome jungle full of venomous snakes and giant spiders and man-eating tigers and howler monkeys screaming overhead. And sunlight broke through the edge of the woods, and we paused to stare out across the wide savanna where the neighbors' dairy cattle became zebras and giraffes and elephants and rhinos. I checked the BB gun that I had converted to a buffalo rifle to make sure I had enough ammo, and then I advised my fellow adventurers to do the same. We were headed into uncharted territory now. There was a watering hole up ahead, but first we would have to make it to the thorny umbrella tree, and once there we would edge our way across the reeds of the pond and carefully pick our way past the giant crocodiles waiting there to eat us whole. And then there would be a hippopotamus that might come charging out of the water to run us down on the land and grab us with their huge gaping jaws, but we were ready for them. After all, we were carrying the same rifles that had killed tyrannosauruses the day before. My sister lifted her finger to her mouth to indicate absolute silence as we quietly worked our way around the far side of the pond, where we were sure that we would capture the giant anaconda that had been eating all the villagers, and then we would take part in a big celebration and be treated as heroes. But imagine our surprise when, as we rounded the far side of the pond, we noticed a man with a red beard sitting there fishing. He wasn't there when we were battling the crocodiles, at least we had not seen him. And we didn't notice him during the great hippo uprising. He wasn't there, and then he was. "What are you kids doing here?" he growled at us. "We're playing," my sister said defiantly. After all, we had permission to be there. "Well, you need to leave," he demanded. "The owner of this land doesn't like people out here." "Mr. Lindahl lets us play out here whenever we want," my sister argued. "Well, I'm the caretaker here," the man said, "and I say get." Back then, kids didn't argue with adults, and we had already done more of that than we were comfortable with. The old man had frightened us. We did what any kids would have done. We tucked tail and ran, and at home we called Mr. Lindahl and told him what happened. "I'm the only caretaker on my land," he assured us. "I don't know who that man is, but I promise you, anytime you kids want, you can play in that meadow." It was an odd incident, but we were children, and children are resilient. Life went on, as it always did, and we never gave another thought to the strange man by the pond. Several years later, when I was 17, I was dating a guy named Tony who liked to hunt, and my dad gave him permission to hunt that 20-acre patch of woods where my sister and I played as kids. One morning, he came back from squirrel hunting, and he shared a strange story with us. "It was the weirdest thing," he said. "I hadn't been out there long, and I know I was all alone. I had to move slowly because every step I took crunched in the leaves. No matter how careful I was, it was impossible to be completely quiet, and that's why I couldn't believe my eyes when I looked up and I saw that man just standing there. It was like he appeared out of thin air. He described the man as having a red beard, and right away Tony asked him what he was doing there on private land, and the man answered that he was the caretaker of the land. A cold chill ran down my spine as I immediately was taken back to that day by the pond. Our man had a red beard. Our man proclaimed himself caretaker of the land. Was he the same guy? I told Tony my story, and we both marveled at the coincidence. We didn't speak about it much after that, but over the years I thought often of that strange man. 10 years later, Tony and I were married, and we purchased the pond from my dad. Dad had aged, and the land had become neglected and overrun with multifloral roses and saplings. The dam that kept the water in the pond had long since washed away, leaving the water level very low. The land was no longer in its prime. For the next 20 years, we set out to repair the dam and make the property a show place. Tony put his whole heart and soul into it, and he cleared away the brush and the trees, and he planted several gardens, and he built rock walls and installed well-groomed paths. Eventually, we built a house overlooking the pond, but Tony never stopped working on the land. And then one Saturday morning, he was out working in the gardens when movement caught his eye. He looked up and saw a man with a white beard standing on the hill. They locked eyes for a moment, and then he lifted his hand and gave Tony a thumbs-up sign. It was as if he was passing the mantle. We've been married for 46 years now, and since that Saturday morning, we've never seen the man again. I don't know where he came from or where he went. I don't expect that we'll ever see him again. He knows that Tony will take care of things, and the land has a new caretaker now. When I was a young child living in Bountiful, Utah, I remember driving up the street toward our house once to see emergency lights lighting up the whole area. Since it was a long, straight street, we could see the red and blue flashing lights from a long way off. The closer we got home, the more concerned my parents became, and it looked like those fire trucks and police cars were parked in front of our house. The relief they felt when they realized that the emergency wasn't happening at our house was quickly replaced with fears for our neighbors. It was their house that had burned. The fire was out by the time we got there, and burned furnishings were being thrown out of the upper story window into the yard, and I remember particularly seeing a huge singed teddy bear that I wished was mine. When we pulled up, the police and firemen asked my dad if he would come with them, apparently to identify a victim. I don't know why no one saw me following my dad, but I remember seeing a fireman pull back a blanket to reveal a lady with a dirty face, and she was sleeping under it. That was how my young mind processed it. And years later, my mother was mortified when I mentioned that I had followed Dad across the yard and I had seen her. I also remember seeing a man run across the yard to the officers in front of his house. He was the husband of one of the two victims. My dad only viewed one of the victims because the other one was apparently burned beyond recognition. The woman I saw was found a few feet from the door as though she was trying to escape. She died of smoke inhalation, and her mother was found on the upper floor. She had fallen asleep while smoking in bed. For days after this, every time my siblings and I went outside to play in our backyard, my mother would call us back into the house. No amount of whining or arguing would change her mind. I even got scolded once for sneaking back outside. Now, this was unusual because Mom had always pushed us out the door to go play, and it kept us out of her hair when she was doing housework. Back then, every week or so, Grandma would come over and watch us so that Mom and Dad could have a night out. A couple of days after the fire was one of those nights. Suddenly, my grandmother got very upset and sent us to our rooms. And we didn't know what we had done, but we were worried that we were going to be punished for upsetting Grandma. When Mom and Dad got home, we listened from our rooms as Grandma told her story through loud sobs. We weren't clear on what she said, and Mom and Dad did not punish us, so we were left in the dark. The strange days following the fire remained a mystery to my siblings and I for years. Eventually, when we were much older, it all came out in a conversation. Only then did we learn why my mother acted so strangely and why my grandmother was so upset. My mother had a gift. It came to her after an incident when she was 18. It isn't my place to share her story. That experience scared her. However, it lifted the veil for her, and she was able to see those around us that others can't. The reason my mother kept calling us kids back inside when we were in the backyard was because the lady who fell asleep smoking was coming into our backyard and my mother could see her. She would call us inside because she was worried that the lady would upset us. But we could not see her, though. Only my mother could. The situation with my grandmother was a bit different. What she had said to my parents through her tears was, "Don't ask me to babysit your kids as long as that dead woman is walking around." Your dad and I immediately looked at each other in surprise, Mom told us. The only person I had said anything about the woman to was our dad. Grandma had no way of knowing what was going on, and this was confirmation to our dad that our mom was telling the truth. The next day, Mom was in the bedroom folding laundry when she started feeling like she was being watched. She looked up expecting one of us kids to be standing there, but instead she came face to face with that woman. She said this was the only time she had ever seen her inside our home, and she was surprised by the unexpected trespass, and Mom got angry. She was a no-nonsense kind of person, and she could be a bit aggressive, and in her anger she confronted the ghostly entity by saying, "What the hell are you doing in my house?" And when the spirit didn't answer but gave her a confused look, she added, "Don't you know that you're dead? You died in a fire 3 days ago. You're not welcome here, so leave." It was the last time my mom ever saw the woman's spirit. The man next door remarried not long after that. His new wife and my mom became well acquainted. She often confided in my mom that strange things often happened in her home, things that she could not explain. One thing that bothered her a lot was the fact that she could never get the door to the upstairs bedroom to open. No matter how hard she tried, it wouldn't open for her, but when her husband tried it, it opened up without any trouble at all. Reluctantly, and after a lot of internal debate, Mom eventually told the new wife about the ghost she had seen and in that room where she had died. Needless to say, the neighbors immediately moved away, most likely at the new wife's insistence. Mom did a little research after that, and she didn't mention to anyone that the dead neighbor's ghost was hanging out in our backyard, but she asked some other of the neighbors a few questions and learned that the woman who died but wouldn't leave had made herself such a nuisance to the people who lived in our house before us that they moved to get away from her. Well, Mom thought maybe that lady was coming to our house looking for her friend who had moved. Years later, I was visiting my optometrist, whose office now sits directly across from where those two houses are. I struck up a conversation with the ladies in the front office, and I told them about the fire and the ghost that kept visiting us afterwards. The next time I came in for an appointment, my optometrist said, "Oh, by the way, thanks for telling my staff about that home across the street. They won't go into the basement now. They say they're afraid because of your story. Now I'm the one who has to go down to the basement to get everything. Thanks." Recently, the entire block where these houses were located was leveled to make room for new houses. I have an appointment with my optometrist soon. I know it isn't nice, but I'm tempted to ask them, now that the old houses have been demolished, where do you think the ghosts have gone? Maybe they've moved over here. What can I say? Everyone has to have a hobby. In 1985, a friend and I were tent camping in the Sierras at a place called Meadow Lake. We set up along the shoreline and we spent our days four-wheeling around the area. At night, we would sit around the campfire and drink cold beer while reliving the joys of the day's explorations. It was a great time that, for the most part, I remember with great fondness. It would have been a perfect trip, if not for one thing. On the last night, as we were enjoying our beers around the fire, we began to hear some strange sounds from across the lake. We were both fairly well versed in the sounds of nature in that area, and neither of us was what you'd call a rookie. But even so, we could not rightly identify what was making these sounds. We each took turns speculating at what it could be, and then listened as the other one gave arguments as to why it could not be that. It was a strange whooping sound, definitely too loud to be any small creature like an owl or a fox. Even wolves seemed too small to make a sound like that, and I could see them making a sound similar to it, but this was deeper and it sounded louder. Well, after a while, we gave up on trying to figure out what it was. Anyway, it was all the way across the lake, and we were tired and it seemed to have died down. Maybe whatever was out there had moved on. It was late, and so we decided to turn in for the night. Sometime between 1 and 2 a.m., I woke up to the call of nature, and as I climbed out of my tent, I realized that my bladder wasn't the only thing calling. Something out there was making a weird woofing sound, and it was closer now, and for the life of me, I still couldn't figure out what it was. I had to study for a minute whether I wanted to step into the tree line to relieve myself or not. My imagination was taking over, and I could picture multiple things out there whooping and growling, and my mind was telling me it was big enough to eat me and hungry enough to do so while I was still breathing. But on the other hand, my bladder was telling me to walk myself into the woods or explain to my camping buddy why my sleeping bag was soaked and smelled of urine. So I went into the woods. I stood there in the dark, and I was aware that the sounds were coming from multiple directions. There was more than one, and that feeling of being watched crawled up my spine and blossomed into goosebumps all over my body. My heart was beating a little too fast, and my breath was coming a little too hard, and I hurried back to the tent and nearly jumped out of my skin when a disembodied voice asked, "Do you hear that?" Well, it was my buddy, and he too had been awakened and was feeling about as concerned as I was. We spent a few minutes trying to locate the calls, determine how many of them there might be out there, and then we built up the fire that we had let die down earlier. I loaded my rifle and took it into the tent with me, and my buddy did the same with a large caliber handgun. We didn't sleep much that night, and as we lay there listening, something walked around the camp inside the tree line. Occasional grunting sounds followed the crunching of the leaves and twigs, and those whooping howls continued until nearly sunrise. And then it all stopped. Once the sun had cleared the horizon, we climbed out of the tent, we swallowed down some hastily made coffee, and we packed up and we left. It's 40 years later, and I still don't have an answer for what we heard that night. I suspect that I know, but how can I prove it? Most people wouldn't believe me, and of those who do, half of them would tell me my life was in deep danger that night, while the other half would tell me I was a fool not to load up a peace pipe and powwow with the damn thing. That's the problem when something has never been identified, recognized, and classified. You can never know for sure. All right, a couple of videos back, I did a story, at the end of the story, I said, sounds like a ghost Dogman, and just, I don't know, off the hip, I said, somebody write me a story about a ghost Dogman or a Dogman ghost, and believe it or not, someone did. Now, this person has sent a story before, and I didn't do it because in the introduction of their email, they said they had sent it to me and another channel that does this. Whenever I get those, I just delete those emails. I defer to the other channel and let them have it because I have so many to do. I have over 2,000. No, I have right at 2,000 emails in my inbox. Probably 1,500 of them I have not even opened, but I know they have stories in them, and I'm guessing out of that 2,000, there's probably about 1,200 stories. The rest of the emails are just emails that I haven't been able to get to. It's hard to keep up with all these emails, but I save them in my inbox and they're there. Anyway, I'm getting off on a tangent, but this person wrote a story about a ghost dogman, and I haven't read it all. I'm just going to read it cold. It's fiction, obviously. I've read a couple of paragraphs of it, and it's really good. So you guys, hang on to your weaves. It's going to be a good one. He watched from the shadow of the woods. It's all he could do now. Just watch and wait and plan. He once had a body. He didn't know how long ago it had been. Even when he had a solid form, he barely noticed the passing of time. Now time had no meaning at all. When he slept, it wasn't really sleep, as he had no body to lie down nor eyes to close, but during the day he sometimes would drift in his mind into the memories of when he was solid and strong. He would escape into the past when his muscles were bulging and his teeth were razor sharp and his claws could tear through metal. He remembered when he would chase down elk or moose and the taste of their blood in the back of his throat. He thought it would last forever, and he feared nothing and no one. Beasts and man were nothing to him but food and entertainment. And when his stomach was full, he would feed on their fear. His appetites were insatiable. Back then, the villagers knew that he was in the woods stalking them, taking them at will to feed on or to toy with as he pleased. Their paranoia and unease was a constant supply, filling the emptiness in his soul. He had laughed at the night they came for him with their pitchforks and muskets. The whole village poured into the forest. Oh, what fun, he thought. What a fantastic game. He would let some of them live so he could savor their fear and despair. He hadn't seen the old woman they protected in their midst. Even if he had seen her, he would have discarded the ancient tiny human. So bent over with age, she looked like nothing more than an old twisted root. But if he had paid any attention to her, he would have felt the ancient power coming off her in waves. As it was, he was reveling in the delight of the chase, and he would let the men corner him, and then just as they descended on him in triumph, he would surge forward, slashing with his claws and biting with his teeth, and he would bathe in the spray of their blood. If he hadn't been so arrogant, he might have noticed the old woman and the signs she was making in the air. The traces of light would follow her hands as she made intricate designs, enchanted words so old only the rocks remembered their origin. He had not been reveling in the gore of his fallen victims. He would have seen her draw an old blade from under her cloak. Even if he had seen it, he would have laughed at the antique blade. It was old and dull, notched with a simple wooden handle, and it seemed to hold no threat to him at all. The men had started to cower and run, and he was in his glory, and they clumped together in their last stand. So he didn't notice when the men parted, and the ancient woman stepped out with an old secret word and plunged the knife into his heart. He wouldn't have thought the old frail woman had enough strength to kill a puppy, but the blade bit into him and sank through his thick skin, piercing his life's source. For the first and last time, he felt real pain, and he felt real fear for the first time, but it would not be his last. He couldn't remember what happened next. He just remembered coming to much later. He was confused and afraid, and he had never felt these things before, and he hated it, and he wanted revenge. And he saw red as he raced through the woods toward the village. He would tear down that old crone limb from limb, but first he would find her many children and eviscerate them in front of her, and then he would take his time with that old woman who dared to bring fear and pain upon him. Upon arriving at the village, he didn't even try to hide himself, so he was very surprised when the people did not react to his presence. Some of them would look at him, but it was like they were looking through him. He could tell some of them sensed his presence. Their eyes would dart about looking for the source of their unease, but it wasn't until he came upon the offspring of the old woman that he was seen. The old woman, summoned by her children, came out of her hut and spoke into the darkness. "You are banished from this place. You have no power over us, and I command you to go back into the darkness from whence you came. I took your body from you, and you know you were doomed to roam the earth, unable to hurt humans any longer. Go now to your eternal damnation and leave the living be. You are not welcome here." And with that, the old woman turned her back on him and went inside her hut. He had never been so insulted and angry, and he raged and screamed and howled. He would soak the ground with their blood, but when he tried to grab the old woman's son and tear his head from his body, his hands went right through the man. It was then that he realized he no longer had form. They had taken his body somehow, and all that was left was his thoughts and his shadow where his bone and muscle once were. For years he sat in the forest and stewed in his anger. His hatred grew as he watched the old woman grow even older until she finally passed away. And it was an empty victory when she passed. There was no triumph for him in the neutral way of things, only in fear and chaos. He stayed at the far edges of the village, and her children could see him, and if he tried to infiltrate their homes to use what little power he had left, which was fear, they would make the same symbol in the air and speak the ancient words, and he was forced deeper back into the woods. So he watched and he waited, and his hunger and his anger grew by the day and by the decade. He satisfied himself by singling out those who wandered too far into the forest. He used his only power left, fear. No one could see him anymore, not since the old woman had passed out of the memory of the living. A few could sense him, and he delighted in these few. He would stalk them through the forest and feed on their uncertainty and unease. But then came a time that even the old woman's descendants could not even sense him, and they walked through the woods freely. They cut down the trees and they built homes, and he could do nothing but watch from the shadows and curse his impotence. Every now and then a child would be born that could sense him, and he would have to satisfy himself with tormenting their minds, but that's all he could do. He no longer had the power to physically affect them. Until one day a boy was born that could see him. Oh, what a glorious day that was! He watched the young boy grow, and he watched the boy's love for the forest also grow. And when he was a small boy, he was always accompanied by his father or his uncles as they taught him the ways of the woods. He waited patiently as he did not want the boy to be forbidden to enter into the deep forest. And finally the day came when the boy was grown enough and the men allowed him to enter the woods alone. And looking back, he wished he had been more patient, but he had waited for so very long that he attacked immediately, forgetting that his claws and teeth had no more force than smoke and fog. The boy fled in terror back to a safe house, and he never entered the forest again. And he grew to be a man, and then he left for many, many years. And when the man's father died, he came back with a wife and a small baby girl to live in the family home. And by now, he had been so alone for so many years, having this new family to watch as his delight. And in this family, he could find a way to exact his revenge and satisfy the never-ending hunger inside of him. He soon learned that the baby girl could not only see him, but she could sense him nearby. Oh, he had not felt this alive since the old crone took his body. He had been the apex predator for millennia. The mere mention of him sent humans fleeing in panic, but he had long been forgotten and was lost from the minds of men, and being seen again was a powerful thing, and he started to feel some of his strength return. The man would leave in the morning in his big shiny car, and the wife would bring the baby into the backyard to play on most days, and he would watch for hours long after they went inside, and he would stand and look in the windows. And when they played outside, the mother would sometimes look up and scan the trees, and then she would hurry the little girl inside. And he could smell the ancient blood in the mother, but it was weak. It was a diluted trace. But still, it was just enough for her to feel goosebumps if he got too close, and he loved every minute of it. When that would happen, the little girl had usually already been watching him. She could see him clearly. It excited him, but she was not afraid. Not yet, he thought. He would soon change that. And as the girl grew, the mother started taking her into the woods on walks. They wouldn't go far at first, but that was okay. He had plenty of time. He had nothing but time. They discovered a pond not far into the forest, and they would come almost every day during the warm season, and the mother would let the little girl splash in the sandy shallows as she sat on a rock nearby. He got bolder, and he would get closer and closer to the pair, and the mother would start to sense him, and he would feel her fear. Oh, the feelings it awoke, feelings of strength, and he missed that power to make humans' heart race with terror and their blood run cold. But he had to be careful. He didn't want to stop them coming like the man did years ago. One day he heard the footsteps in the woods, and he felt his non-existent pulse quicken. He hadn't felt this real in so long, and today was going to be the day. Even the unease and feelings of paranoia had been enough to start returning his strength to him. But to his surprise, it wasn't just the mother and the little girl, but the father was with them, and the man's face was filled with uncertainty, even all these years later. He was so used to being unseen that he had not tried to hide himself in a long time, so he stood in the open next to the pond as the small family emerged from the trees. The little girl smiled at him and started to run in his direction, but her mother, sensing something wrong, held her child back. The father looked to see what his family was reacting to, and the blood drained from his face. And the man grabbed his wife and daughter, and he fled back to the house. The beast's rage was immeasurable. His prize had been taken from him. His moment of triumph had been destroyed. His hatred was renewed when he slept, and he dreamt about the night the old woman had taken his body from him. But he could do nothing but rage and howl from the woods, unable to affect the physical world. None of the family returned to the woods, and soon after, workmen came and they dug a hole in their backyard. They made walls of cement and tile and filled it with water, and after that the mother and the little girl swam in the backyard and no longer returned to the little pond. This made him angry. It had been so long just watching the world, unable to interact with it, and this man had taken away what little pleasure he had. That night he stormed into the backyard, and he slashed and bit at the contraption that was attached to the pond they had made. He ripped with his teeth as he growled and raged into surprise and delight when a gash appeared in the hose that fed the water to the pool. He had never before been able to do this. A sense of satisfaction crept over him. The next day, when the mother and the girl went to swim in their backyard, they saw the damage, and the mother was angry, and when the man came home, he could feel the rage from where he was far in the trees. This was exciting to the beast, and he found a way to cause more fear and panic, and he could feel his strength returning, and he could almost feel the blood pumping through his heart. But to his disappointment, the workmen came and repaired the damage that he had done, and life went on for the family. He was furious, and he tried to destroy the contraption again, but he could not manage the destruction that he did the first night, and he raged and howled through the night, and the neighbor's dogs took up the call, and his own cries were drowned out by the yapping of the lesser canines, which only made him more furious. For years he watched this family, and his fury and his hatred grew day by day and year by year. The little girl was now almost an adult, and it seemed she had many friends and they would visit often. He was often successful at scaring the friends, not that they could see him, of course, but once in a while they could sense him and the hair on the back of their necks would rise and they would become fearful. But the girl, who he knew could sense him, never seemed afraid. He would content himself with a small triumph as he waited eternally in the darkness. Many nights he would go to the window of the girl and scratch on the glass, and she would look up from her book and give a glance at the window, but he never felt the rising fear in her like he did in the others. This frustrated and intrigued him, and by now the girl only came to the house during the summer, and in the fall she would leave with bags packed full of her stuff, and she would not return to stay until the spring had come, and he would spend these long winters alone in the darkness of the deep woods, stewing in his hatred. One summer he was in the backyard watching the house as the girl had just returned home. He had been doing nothing but watch. He hadn't even tried to scare her. He was just glad to have something to fill his empty thoughts. And the moon had set, and the world was inky black, but he did not need light to see. And suddenly he sensed another presence. It was not the man, not the wife, but it was something else. It was human. It was barely a thought, and it was creeping toward the house from the far side of the garage. And he could sense the man strongly, and he could hear the man's thoughts, and the man had come for the girl. He was a child of darkness and understood all that held. And this man, although he was of the darkness, he was not the same. The man was of decay and rot and perversion, and the twisted mind of the man and the joy he took in hurting others was not the same as his own lust for fear and pain, and this man disgusted him. Where he longed for the taste of blood in the back of his throat and the feel of his claws slicing through organs and flesh, this man wanted their pain, and he wanted to satisfy his own mortal urges, and the man was coming for the girl. The girl's parents had left for the night, and the man had known this, and she was in the house alone. And the man crept silently to the back door, and after a moment he broke the lock and then slid open the door and silently snuck into the house. At first he was excited. This man would surely strike fear into the girl, and he would feast for a week. He could watch as the blood flowed, but he would not be able to taste it himself, he thought. And suddenly he was more angry than he had ever imagined. This man, this human, would not offer the girl death, not any time soon anyway. He went into the man's thoughts, and he did not like it in the man's head. He did not like the feeling of sickness, the decay of a mind. And the man might be a predator, but he was not a predator. He was a coward. The man was weak. His only power was to hide in the shadows and strike when no one was around to stop him, and he could not bear that the girl's life would be taken by such a disgusting being. She belonged to him. She was of the ancient blood. She was his. She deserved better than to be taken by a creature so weak and undeserving. He raced into the house. He had not been constrained by walls in a very long time, but he had not wanted to acknowledge his lack of true form. So he had seldom walked through the walls into the house, but he did so tonight without a second thought. And the man stood now over the girl's bed as she slept, and the man was just watching her with growing excitement, thinking about all the things that he would do once he got her into his hidden lair. And his hatred of the man was palpable, and his rage made him feel solid again. Several things happened all at once. He wasn't sure which happened first. Perhaps it was his howl. Perhaps it was the sharp intake of the breath from the man, or perhaps the girl's instincts knew to wake her, but she sat up in bed just as he launched at the man. The girl did not scream, but clutched at her covers and drew back to the corner of the bed, and he grabbed the man by the throat, and his claws raked against the man's ribs as his teeth found purchase in his throat. And it felt so real to him, like when he had a solid form, that he could taste the blood in the back of his throat, the hot tangy with the taste of copper and with the man's terror. It wasn't until he spared a glance to the girl that he realized the man's blood really was flowing out of his body. Some of it had sprayed onto the girl, and he thought she had never looked so beautiful, and she sat there, terror in her eyes, covered in a spray of blood. And in his shock, he stopped the attack and looked down at his own body. and he could see his long arms and huge hands and his sharp claws, now bright red with the man's life blood. And he could even see his own shadow on the wall, and his pointed ears and his long snout and a sharp profile. And he was so stunned that he froze. The man now lay on the ground next to the girl's bed, no longer breathing, his throat ripped open and his ribs exposed, and the backpack he carried spilled open and its contents littered the floor. There was duct tape, a blindfold, there were zip ties and other such things that were scattered about. The girl's eyes opened wide with understanding, and then she lifted her head to look at him. And to his surprise, the fear in her eyes was gone, and it was replaced with something else, something he did not recognize. He thought he should feel rage and anger at the fact that she was not afraid now. She should be afraid, he thought. He was so fearsome to the whole village that they would cower at a mere glimpse of him. Yet here she was looking at him with no fear, no panic, no terror. But he didn't feel angry. He felt seen. In his confusion, all he could think was that he wanted to be back into the forest, deep out into the woods again. He should be celebrating. He should be savoring his kill, his victory. He had longed for the moment like this since the night the villagers came for him, yet he didn't feel any of that. He did not understand what was happening, and he turned to flee through the door because he did not want to walk through the wall. He did not want this girl to see the humiliation and the proof of his weakness. And as he was turning to go, the girl called out to him, "Thank you. I always knew you were there. I knew you were my guardian angel sent to protect me, no matter what anyone said." And with that, he fled back into the depths of the forest. Okay, that was kind of a dramatic story. It was a really good fictional horror story. And this woman came up with this like within a couple of days after I said, "Hey, somebody write me a Dogman ghost story." And she took it to heart. I appreciate this so much. I just got it yesterday and I thought, I have got to read this. Thank you so much for writing this to the writer. She said I think it's a woman. I think from her email name, I think it's a woman. So if I've got that wrong, I'm sorry to the writer. But what a great story. Thank you so much for doing this, for writing this. I just loved it. I loved it. I know it's kind of long, but I hope you guys enjoyed it. This was kind of a spur of the moment thing she wrote. I don't know what else to say about it. I really loved it, so thanks. Hope you all enjoyed that podcast. I appreciate you clicking on the video or the podcast. And there weren't many comments by me, which some people will appreciate. I'll do a few of those like that and just read the story. Because there are people who don't like to hear me run my mouth, which is perfectly fine. Perfectly fine, doesn't hurt my feelings a bit. But there's one without the commentary. Hope you enjoyed it, and we'll see you guys on the next one. Thank you.